To the last panel session for the day. We will try to remain alert and spirited despite being last. So my name is Angela Sass. I'm from UCL and I co-chair the working group 2 with Bill Dutton in this project. The final session here will be looking at, we've got speakers representing some very major organizations in this space, and what they will be doing in this session is talk to us about what their plans are for the coming year, sort of takeaways from what happened this year and plans for the coming year. And I'm also trying to nudge them to say, apart from your organization, who do you think should be doing exactly what more in order to improve on the current state of affairs, to move things on. Now we have to be mindful that the speakers are representing major organizations and therefore may not be able to speak on behalf of those organizations off the cuff in a way. But maybe we can also then address that in the discussion session on. So we've got Derek O'Halloran from the World Economic Forum, who will be speaking first, Adrian Lapointe, who will be representing the US State Department's perspective on takeaways, and finally Healy Timar-Clark, who is basically representing, talking to us about a particular case study, but also has insights from NATO and from the EU on this. So we'll start with Derek, if you'd like to kick us off.
Sure, thank you very much, Angela. So just like to start off by adding my own thanks to Sadie for the invitation and the opportunity to come and join today, and particularly to share some of the work that we're doing. And also to just say congratulations. I think that the launch of this centre is a really fantastic step forward globally, and I'm very excited about the programme of work that it has laid out. Okay, so I've been asked just to share a little bit about what the World Economic Forum is doing in this space, and in particular what our plans are for 2014. It might just be worth giving a little bit of context in terms of why we are doing anything in this space at all. Really our involvement in the topic of cybersecurity stretches back around 3 or 4 years when we were asked by our stakeholders, which are major international organizations as well as governments and businesses, to pick up the topic. And really when we looked at it and we said, well, what are the particular area, the particular gap that the forum, the World Economic Forum, could perhaps look to fill in, where we're not replicating work that's already going on. And the key area we identified was the real lack of understanding, at that time awareness, and sometimes arguably still so, but certainly the real lack of understanding and action among top leadership across all domains, i.e. not just technology industry and the ICT ministries, but across all of the other areas where technology is having an impact. And so that's really our role, is to look to say, how do we begin to encourage that dialogue at the top leadership level as our world is changing. So just to go in then in terms of what it is that we're looking to do in 2014, I thought I'd offer, first of all, 2 contextualizing observations around the nature of the issue, and then secondly offer the 3 key points that we want to have, the current thinking is, that we want to have on the agenda for 2014. So the first observation is, when we talk about cybersecurity, we're not talking about an isolated issue. That this is actually part of, and sometimes is driven by, a much broader transformation that's happening in our society, one of digital hyperconnectivity. And what I mean by that is the rapidly increasing rate at which individuals, people, processes and things are being connected to the internet. And that this has pretty important implications, because what it's doing is it's changing the implication, the impact of technology in our society away from being one of efficiency and towards being one of transformation. Right? We are shifting from worlds of hierarchies to worlds of networks. And this while the disintermediation of various different networks offers huge social and economic gains, it also provides some significant new challenges in terms of governance and in terms of how we provide assurance and security in such an environment. Just to play out, okay, well, what exactly do we mean by this? Well, if we look at the media industries, for example, over the last 10 or 15 years, where we had very large, centralized companies that controlled those industries, once you have peer-to-peer networks and they're able to share information directly, well, then it reduces the need for those overall hierarchies. And what we're seeing already is, as the Internet of Things is right at the very beginning, is that what happened to the media industries and what happened to the B2C industries is about to happen for the B2B industries. And the physical industries, the heavy industries, all of these, the fundamental structure of their industry is going to change. So this is just worth bearing in mind, that the structure of our economy is changing as we are trying to deal with this issue. And that will have implications for how we want to address, and where I think the question came up earlier, you know, to really be conscious of where are the centers of power in this, because at the end of the day, that's where decisions will get made, and that they are shifting. The second observation I make is that cybersecurity, while it's not an isolated issue, it's also not a single issue. And I think everyone in this room knows this, but in terms of something that we continuously try to remind people, is that just because it's one word and just because we have one internet, it doesn't mean that we're dealing with one issue. In the, in quotes, real world, things such as retail fraud, diplomacy and warfare, personal privacy, intellectual property, copyright issues are all treated very, very differently. And we've evolved different institutions to deal with these different issues in different ways. Of course, we can't rely on those old institutions anymore, because, as we've seen, they're too slow for the rapidly evolving world that that the internet is driving us into. And I think perhaps even more interestingly, it's not even just the old institutions we can't rely on, it's perhaps the old norms, because words like privacy just simply don't mean the same thing anymore. So having just advocacy for a particular norm is perhaps not enough unless we recognize that the context for those norms have changed, and therefore they are being redefined as we go through. So just as much as our economies are being reconstituted, so are our societies. In a sense, we're the kind of the Magna Carta moment, or the rewriting of the social contract moment. And that's not a single point in time, but that's a process. So there would be the two observations I make. In terms of the agenda for the forum in 2014, first and foremost, top of the list is to really draw out cybersecurity as an economic issue. Yes, it is a political issue, and yes, it's a technology issue and a technical issue, but the impact on our economic well-being is significant, and it's perhaps not talked about as much as it should be. And particularly for the leaders of domains in policy domains that are non-ICT, and the leaders of businesses that are the non-IT and telecoms, the implication of the different paths that we may be about to embark down in terms of different policy frameworks globally, in terms of levels of trust, in terms of balkanization of the internet, the implications that they have for our collective ability to drive growth and jobs and innovation is simply not understood. And so we've been working this year with a whole series of processes where we did surveys with 150 different executives and experts globally, which are feeding into scenarios which will try to paint the picture of what is it going to look like 5 years from now, right? If we just muddle through. What is it going to look like if we have a large-scale loss of trust, either because of a single big event or because of gradual erosion, or if we have a fragmented policy framework in different jurisdictions around the world, perhaps even incoherent policy frameworks, where in one country the requirements on a company are simply incompatible with the requirements in a different country. The balkanization of the internet. What are the implications on the the gains we have already made in terms of globalization, in terms of global supply chains, in terms of the trade that we have. And what are the implications then in terms of the political relationships as they begin to spill over into other trade domains? So really putting this issue as a core economic concern. The other thing about talking about it as an economic issue is that it provides, I think, a much more productive space for constructive dialogue. If we talk about it as a political, as something around warfare or espionage, we're automatically into one against one and negotiations. And so focusing on the economic aspect, the fact that we're all interdependent, and that the flow of data and the assurance of trust, collective assurance of trust that cybersecurity drives is at the absolute foundation of all of these great promises we hear about what technology is going to bring to us, is a message that we would really want to drill home. And I'll just say, by the way, as an aside, if we want to maximize the space for constructive dialogue and the economic side, there still needs to be the political side, and I just want to say a very large congratulations to NEMA and the OSCE process. I think that's a fantastic step forward. So the second thing on our agenda will be to start with what we know. Okay? We heard a lot today around the number of attacks that can be stopped and the number of things that we already know can be done. We've heard lots of great examples of people that are doing things in different domains in different areas. So let's start with where we know, with what we know. And this is where we will hopefully tie in with the capacity building program with the school here. This is something that we did with individual companies a couple of years ago. We launched principles for cyber resilience, and those principles and guidelines, and we got companies to sign up, and it gave them, the CEOs and the boards within those organizations, very simple, actionable items that they could do within their own organizations, and that was very successful. And I think now if we play that out across nations and look at cyber security capacity building for programs and frameworks, well then that's something that we can, I think, will have real impact. In particular, our space, we started off earlier this year thinking about maybe creating a fund, and our private sector partners would provide financial assistance or expertise. As we put together the framework for what those funds might be used for and shared them with our partners, it was interesting that all of the most excited feedback we got was on the framework, not on the money. And it comes back to, I think, the point that was made at the end of the last session. If we can develop a shared set of frameworks, if we can develop a shared language, if we can develop a shared set of concepts around this, well, then we're already a step ahead. So throughout 2014, we hope to be working very closely with the Oxford School here, as well as a number of other international organizations, potentially governments and private sectors, who are developing frameworks, and to provide a platform where they can come together and share how they are evolving and developing their frameworks, and to build that common language as we go forward. And then finally, the third point on our agenda for next year is to really just keep asking questions. So there's a lot of stuff we know, what we need to do already. Let's start doing that. But there's a whole set of questions that are just really tricky. And we need to keep asking them. And it's not just us that have to answer those questions. So we need to keep engaging those business leaders and decision makers in the non-ICT industries and the policymakers in the non-ICT spaces, because at the end of the day, they're going to be the ones that really make the decisions about how security is going to play out in the supply chain industry, in the transport industry, in the health industry, and all these industries. So we need to engage with them and help them start the journey that they need to take that will bring them to the place where they're equipped to make those decisions in their own domains. Because I think at the end of the day, this is evolving, the space is evolving from being a specialist concern. We'll always still need to have that. But in the 21st century, this is really a basic skill set, I think, for leaders across any domain. Thank you.
Is there any immediate question to Derek? Or nope. So let's welcome the second speaker, Adrian Lapointe, who's Senior Policy Advisor in the Office of the Coordinator for Cybersecurity Issues in the US State Department. And she'll be talking about takeaways from the Seoul conference this year and looking forward to 2014.
Perfect.
And
Thank
we've
you
even
so
managed
much.
to get her slides up just in time.
Yes, so let me start off by thanking Sadie and the Oxford Center and Lucy, both for fixing this and for doing such a wonderful job with this. It's been a pleasure to be here all day. And to express my admiration for your wonderful artist. Don't we all feel that we have to do something especially creative here? And now you must give me a really nice illustration. I'll start off by saying just a little tiny bit about the Seoul conference, although I'm not really going to focus on that very much. How many of you were at the Seoul conference? Yeah, so as you all know, as you can attest, we had a very heavy emphasis this year on cyber capacity building, because this is obviously the topic of the moment. And for good reasons. It's not just a fad. It really is something that we very, very much need to focus on, because it's the answer to so many of our questions, or perhaps not the answer, but the necessary precondition to solve many of the problems that we care most about. In the run-up to the Seoul conference, both the UK and the US, as well as Hungary, and most particularly, of course, the hosts in the Republic of Korea, held pre-conference workshops. The Koreans held a wonderful cyber capacity building workshop, which I was lucky enough to attend. And the US held a cyber capacity building workshop that focused on the role of industry in cyber capacity building. That was an absolutely fascinating activity from my point of view, because I certainly felt I learned a great deal from it, not least how many folks in industry are genuinely and significantly interested in cyber capacity building. I was really quite touched by the number of people who are willing to take a day out of extremely busy schedules to come and brainstorm with us. We did a bunch of workshops on different topics with industry leads, and so this wasn't a come and listen event. This was a come and talk and be pressured event. But they came, and many of them flew in from out of town, some of them from overseas. So I came away from that thinking there's really a wonderful, strong community there that can be worked with going forward. But really what I want to talk about today is what the US government has been doing in the recent past related to cyber capacity building. What we've been working on most recently is stock taking. It seemed to us that before we knew how we wanted to move forward, it would be rather helpful if we knew where we had been, and in particular, where we are right now. We were positing that, in fact, there was a lot more activity underway than any of us knew. And that has indeed turned out to be the case, although, in fact, we've just scratched the surface. So, as you can imagine, it's a bit of a challenge to know how to go about doing a data call across a large government with many different agencies and departments, many of which do cyber capacity building under different names, and to get some kind of reasonable information. And the answer to all this is, of course, we didn't. We didn't get reasonable information. We got a first stab. So we went out to a relatively small number of departments and agencies with a spreadsheet that I and the team I work with put together. And we knew we weren't going to get great stuff. We figured a lot of the information would be in the big block that was narrative, and that we'd have to pull information out of it. And sure enough, that turned out to be the case. I sat down with support staff over the past couple of weeks, and we read through every single thing we got, and we attempted to determine what kind of activity this actually was. And it was really very, very interesting, the results we got. But what we figured, and I'll come back to that in just a second, we figured that seeing what we were doing might reflect some of our strengths. So if we saw patterns, perhaps that would mean that we were good at doing these things. On the other hand, it might be that we would find these were just things that were easy to do. But in order to assess the value of what we're doing and to consider where we might move out into new areas, we really felt we had to get this under control. So the question of how to define what we were asking for was a bit of a challenge. And this was the definition we sent out to the folks who were going to answer our questionnaire. Cyber capacity building, we defined as the support provided to developing nations to increase their access to and ability to fully benefit from the internet and other elements of cyberspace. The idea was to distinguish between diplomacy and capacity building. That was kind of foremost in our minds. We also wanted to distinguish it from regular development work. So, for instance, when the U.S. International Cyber Strategy came out a couple of years ago, departments and agencies were asked to see what they were doing that was responsive to the goals in that strategy. And the development agencies looked at what they were doing and saw things that they thought could slot in. So what tends to happen is, if somebody is using ICTs, that becomes cyber capacity building. So if you're using computers to track maybe large equipment that you're bringing in to build roads, is that cyber capacity building? Well, probably not. On the other hand, if you were bringing in computer networks to track the importation of large equipment, and you were training local personnel, and you were leaving them with the software and hardware, then maybe it is cyber capacity building. Maybe you're giving them skills and you're giving them equipment that they can use in some other way. So it becomes very subtle. In the same kind of way, does going to a conference constitute cyber capacity building? Is it diplomacy? Or is it just a visit? Or is it something where you're actually assisting another nation to develop policy or learning what they need? So we had a fair number of folks who provided input on things they had gone to that were clearly diplomacy. So we wanted to kind of emphasize that diplomacy is distinct from cyber capacity building, but as I think was mentioned earlier today, you also need diplomacy to encourage countries to have the political will to actually meet goals in cyber capacity building, to advance. So there's a way in which diplomacy plays a role too. So the bottom line here is that this is hard. So as I say, our initial results were both that it was hard and that one of the ways in which it was particularly hard had to do with taxonomy. So let me go. Well, no, there we go. So as we had all this data coming in, my goal was to put together a database. And I imagined just tagging all this data in a variety of different ways so we could kind of visualize it in a very multidimensional fashion. And that's what I set out to do. But as I showed this to people, and I said, here are all the attributes, I found that folks would say, well, no, wait a minute, I want a hierarchy, and you're not mentioning X, Y, and Z. So for instance, I didn't have international security on mine. I didn't have internet freedom. Those are ways in which the US likes to look at things like capacity building. We care about these. These are goals. These are things we might want to support in the world, which is completely valid, of course. But once you start thinking in that way, you are developing more of a prescriptive taxonomy here. So I think that as we move forward, it's important to have both, to recognize that different nations will have different prescriptive taxonomies, approaches, and there will be basic underlying attributes of capacity building efforts that will be common to all of us. So for instance, this could be arranged in terms of the WSIS action lines. And that would be another way of organizing it, equally valid, just for a different purpose. So what I'm hoping we can do is put together, and this is in the future, a really functional database that tags very, very exhaustively so that we can look at things from as many perspectives as possible. And one of the challenges I think that we've gotten, and I'm hoping some of you will be joining me tomorrow morning to do a workshop on taxonomy, is to talk about how we can come up with approaches, terminologies, categories, useful language, to talk about cyber capacity building activities in a way that's independent of the idiosyncrasies of our government organizations. So I've heard people say, for instance, that separating cybercrime from cybersecurity is problematic. And I can see why someone might say that is the case. On the other hand, in my government, for instance, the authorities and the funding to do those things live in different places. So it's a natural separation. Doesn't mean you can't do them together. It doesn't mean they can't come together, but for us, that's important. So that would be reflected in our hierarchy, but maybe not in someone else's. All right, so next steps. We're moving on to new and more improved stock taking, going out with a second data call in December with a vastly improved questionnaire, I hope. And who knows, maybe after we meet and talk tomorrow, it will become even better because I will have input from colleagues. We're going to continue to encourage other nations to take stock of what they're doing so that we can compare notes. If we can come up with a common vision of categories, as I've just described, then we can work together to see, first of all, to share best practices. If we know we're doing something with the same goal, then we can actually talk about what's worked best for each of us. We can coordinate to support each other's work. Ultimately, we can perhaps decide, you do this, I do this, and we get proper coverage. But to be able to do that, we have to be sure we're talking about the same thing. I think as well that we think it would be beneficial if developing nations take stock too, because they need to be able to articulate effectively what their needs and priorities are. And in order to do that, there needs to be awareness of what's currently happening on the ground. And my guess would be that just as we are still not confident that we know everything we're doing, they probably are not really fully aware of everything going on in their spaces. So our vision going forward, still very general, but I personally, as I look forward, think about the value of a networked approach, and several people have mentioned this way of coming at the problem. I kind of envision something a little like a set of DNS servers, where you have perhaps portals around the world, hopefully some of them in the developing world. Each node knows about what every other node knows about. We don't have any one center that has primary responsibility, but we all keep track of what we're best at, and we know when something comes to us that we don't handle well, whom to send the person to or the country to. Go see them, they're working on this, they're doing innovative things. If we do something like this right, if it happens, we can, I think, be more innovative and learn from each other and work in a more effective collaborative way. And we think that this kind of approach has the potential to spark a whole lot of innovation and advance. So, Angela suggested we might want to pass out some questions to you folks, and I have a couple of them that I'll mention real quickly. The first one is how we compare very different activities. So in sending out my questionnaire, one of the first big problems I had, looking at my response, was I say, how many people are affected? I get 6 people, because we trained 6 people. Then I get 1 country, which is a little bit hard to compare, right? Apples and riding a bicycle. How does one decide how to compare efforts? If you're looking at distinct initiatives, is it something like scope of the effort plus impact plus results? I mean, I really don't know. That's a really hard one. So your wise thoughts on this over time would be much appreciated. And then my second question kind of picks up on what Derek was saying a little bit. And it's not exactly capacity building, but it's slightly related. We all, I think, like to think that a free and open internet promotes economic growth by enabling innovation. But we don't have research that I'm aware of, and we have looked, that gives us hard evidence for that. So if we have anyone in the room who's spoiling for a really terrific dissertation or a grant-getting research project, let me offer that one up to you, and I don't even need to be cited. We would much appreciate seeing the results on that, because that's going to be so important going forward, being able to actually make the case to developing nations that as we help them build capacity and as they grow, to keep that internet open and free. And that's it. Thank you.
Okay, our final speaker is Heleti Maklar, and she will be telling us about the lessons from the Estonian experience and plans for new cybersecurity capacity building in the EU. And if there's time, you may mention NATO with some insights from NATO as well.
So, good afternoon. It's not easy to be a last speaker. And thank you for organizing this wonderful event. I have named my presentation National Cybersecurity Strategies and How to Translate Success Stories to Global Cyber Capacity Building Success Stories. So this is the any government or boardroom or group of decision makers nowadays. They basically do not use paper so much anymore. They rely on the devices, on computers, on laptops. This, of course, is the Estonian government. After 2007, actually. What it means for us, how we collectively are able to convince all the high-level decision makers that the devices and the technology they are using actually is trustable and resilient, and so that they can be sure this will not turn against them. I think we are having good discussion on how to do it, and possibly these discussions continue. And I'm very glad to hear from Derek that this discussion also now takes place at a very, very global level between very serious people who are doing all the important decisions for the world economy. Before I start my more conceptual style presentation, I should make a disclaimer that anything which I say today does not represent the official position of the European Union, and is my own personal view on those issues. So what we see now, we see the different layers of cyber threats, possibly. I'm sorry to start from the threat-centric approach, which I possibly do not like myself anymore, but before this used to be maybe a paradigm how this was looked, and I think in order to actually explain to non-cyber specific policymakers, which has been my job for the last 5 years, to make them understand what is cyber, this has helped a lot. If you look at the different layers that we have, global, state level, societal level, sectoral, industry layer, and individual level, then each of those segments actually requires different public policy response. You have all these cyber discussions where people are intermittently discussing state behavior, home user problem, and so on and so forth. I think now it's time to move on and concentrate on exact questions in those different layers or levels in order to achieve something, because there has been too much talk on everything at the same time when we are coming together to cyber events. So I think when we are actually doing capacity building, which we are doing today now in this room, then we have to think through what exactly is the segment of the public policy where we have to target here. And I think we can possibly say that we should think about societal, sectoral and industry level, because this is what the developing countries need most. Individual level, of course, is also important, but this possibly comes after when the capacity building is already understood by the home governments, host governments where we're doing our activities, and then they take care of the individual user awareness, because with our limited resources we would be never able to reach all the individuals in the world. So, what are the policymakers' challenges in capacity building? I think every one of us in this panel actually mentioned hierarchies versus networks challenge, and this is possibly shared by the auditorium here. We have the different origin of the attacks than we usually had in our state-centric model. We have networked actors and with fluid identities. The problem for the hierarchical institutions is grave. They are going to be brought down, as Derek said. They are already changing in the economic world. We haven't seen that happening too much maybe in government world, but they are changing definitely because of the nature of the society is really changing because of technological change. And the targets of the new threats are also kind of changing. It must be not always destruction that we are looking for, which is the usual thing that we are thinking when we talk about, for instance, warfare. Why not we should not start thinking that if Facebook will be down for 2 weeks, what actually this will mean for our peace and security? maybe we will have a major problem, really. Maybe it's not so easy in the end if our lifestyle is attacked. I'm kind of joking here, but let's think about our future generation growing up. So and therefore we have to possibly think through the more strategic notions, as I think I found it very exciting how Derek put this. What we have to do, what we can do at national level is quite clear. We can significantly improve the national cyber coordination and set the national strategic goals. And this is possibly what we could sell to the developing nations, that if they want to become good cyber citizens that are also able to benefit from the technology that has been brought to them, then they have to build it up themselves, and they have to make sure that their own stakeholder community actually also shares this vision. So I have put down some major notions that possibly is not new for all cyber crowd in the room. We need the dialogue with the private sector, the system how to protect the critical services. We need some sort of national early warning information exchange mechanism. We need also the escalation mechanism for the cyber crisis, and we need the mainstreaming cyber issues into risk management at national level and possibly at company level. It all requires a lot of effort and education. We need to educate the decision makers, the public, the policymakers, and of course we should strengthen the cybersecurity institutions, because without institutions, as we have seen, the capacity building efforts are not sustainable. Since I had an interesting chance to be in charge of the Estonian capacity building effort after 2007 attacks, without any proper knowledge on information security or technical issues in my former life. So I had to learn it hard way. But I think the good message for everyone in this room who doesn't have technical background is that actually the big technical background does not help you if you do the national public policy. You have to have the experience of doing national public policy, and then you can switch it easily to the cyber business. So it's not a rocket science. What we did in Estonian cybersecurity effort, we combined the top-down and bottom-up. We combined government programs with more horizontal responsibilities for all citizens. There are informal networks in every society and citizen activity. So if the government is able to grasp this resource and combine this with more hierarchical efforts that governments will and have to do, then possibly the cyber effort is most resilient. If it's the government-only effort, possibly this will fall short in the end. And that's why I think the Estonian cyber strategy is still a little different strategy when we compare it with some other strategies, where the citizen participation and the bottom-up is also recognized. So the objectives of the strategy were to reduce vulnerability of cyberspace in the country, to advance the national system for the critical information infrastructure protection, to enhance international cooperation and encourage cyber diplomacy. In 2008, cyber diplomacy was an unheard notion, and now we all talk about it. So some of the goals in the strategy have been achieved. To raise awareness on cybersecurity in full society, I think this is possible in a smaller society, yes, which is very dependent on online services, but possibly this is difficult in some larger countries. And of course, there was some light touch regulation that helped the CIIP system to put in place. Basically, what we did was that we started to protect and invest into what was critical, but not so much according to the sectoral logic, but according to the logic of different interdependencies between the most critical and then the less critical. We actually mapped all the critical services. We know the number of the critical services in the country, and we know the number of the companies that provides all the critical services of the country. Again, it is a small experiment in a small society, but I think the problems that we crossed are structural, and I'm listing some of the issues what private sector is going to ask if you do this from the government side. The private sector is going to ask you, what exactly is there for me? Why should I start doing this voluntary cooperation with public-private partnership with the government? Why should I let you to know where are my interdependencies on the others? And why should you, government, somehow have a role there? In the end, we, I think, had one private sector actor in Estonia who did not want really to have a share or part in this national voluntary cooperation framework. The others actually demanded it. And what actually private sector asked was many things. First, they wanted to have a vision for all stakeholders in a country, because they had been attacked by quite serious attackers in the criminal world, and the utilities, the banking sector and the telecom had already started cooperating themselves amongst each other to somehow share information and make sure that they are more prepared. So the ones who were under heavy attacks, they always wanted more government involvement. The second thing that they asked for was a framework for linking different cyber communities together. So the first thing was government light incentives, training, exercises, education, awareness raising of the public. The fourth was the national resources in case something very serious happens or there are advanced persistent threats that the companies that are not used to this kind of more state-sponsored activities would not cope with. Then they asked also what are the dependencies of their critical services on the other sectors' critical services, because when there is a time of crisis, then you have to actually react very quickly. When you have the energy systems that you have to maintain, you have to know what exactly you can let go and what you have to maintain. So this kind of interdependency system has to be there, and it has to be made by some sort of semi-government, at least, agency, because you cannot rely on private sector only there. And then, of course, what government was also asked to do was to advance the weaker critical companies. You have always, in every nation, you have some weak companies not so able to invest into quite expensive cybersecurity programs. So, and therefore, basically we were able to put together the national system that relies on voluntary public-private partnership approach in critical information infrastructure protection. So I now have listed the major parts of this public-private partnership: identification of critical services, light touch regulation, which means that we just listed the critical services in one law, and we said in this law that all the companies that are providing these critical services have to send the IT or have to do IT risk audits every year. And if there is a major disruption of the service, they have to notify national CERT. So that was the whole regulation, basically. Then there was a lot of interaction with these critical companies, and they were very happy in the end that the government has set up an agency that could help the weaker ones. So this advising and overseeing was useful for them. Of course, for the big banks it wasn't a problem. They could do it themselves. Then educating employees, managers and CEOs, and mainstreaming cyber issues to different other national policy-making mechanisms. For instance, the national cyber crisis plans now cyber crisis components are part of any national crisis component and so on. So this is what I call the capability pyramid at national level, and it gives you the idea where the most effort should lie. The most effort should lie within very civilian field, which is like 90% of the pyramid, which is Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Communication, Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Economic Affairs, and whatever there is in different nations that is in charge of cyber resilience at large. National defense, military has a very small part there because you need military approach in case really you have to step up in a very improbable event of large-scale military activity, which we haven't luckily experienced in last decades in Europe. So the focus should go to the bottom of the pyramid: resilience, protection of critical services, public-private partnership, addressing cybercrime, and how to bring in non-state actors, the private sector and citizen initiatives. And you can have different legal frameworks to do it, and it depends on your institutional, cultural, and other already set parameters, how the legality of the system is perceived. And in a small country up in the north where you had to stand there for 1,000 years, this legal part is not very important because people would do the voluntary cooperation. But maybe in some other places it is more important. So, in overall, in Europe, we actually can observe different national cyber models. So this one I described was just a specific, more Nordic, Northern European model. And this small, medium country model, which we now have seen, is characterized by strong public-private partnership, voluntary coordination, and citizen participation. You have the larger country model also in EU, different ones actually. You have this more intelligence-led mixed coordination model and more regulatory top-down coordination model in several other European countries. The national model should be there, and how to do it is up to the nation. When we go to different parts of the world and start helping those developing nations, we cannot sell them our model. They have to figure it out themselves. Because everything they do, it depends on the historical, institutional and cultural factors that are already there in this country. We cannot change those things. Our one-size-fits-all model wouldn't work, so we have to see the local picture. So, coming now to a more international level, we have the policy requirements that we have to fulfill, and as I already have said here many times, I think the civilian governance mechanisms for cybersecurity is a very important notion that we possibly have to pursue in the future. in multi-stakeholder format, of course. For the state behavior, we need norms and rule of law in cyberspace. We need also to achieve minimum national cybersecurity resilience. To think about national and international public-private partnerships and how we can build up early warning, crisis response and recovery mechanisms at a more global level with the private sector. Assistance for technologically less advanced nations in cyber capacity building is the topic for today, and this is possibly one of the least attended topics amongst this list. At least I think I haven't been in more than 2 capacity building meetings so far, which are devoted only to the capacity building, but I have possibly attended like 500 different cyber events on all other topics. And what EU is doing? EU had one stock-taking event some time ago where we actually were trying to see what the different EU nations and EU agencies had been doing in capacity building and what is our collective experience in this field. We haven't been able to put together the good taxonomy as our US colleagues are now starting to do it, but possibly we should do it at some point as well. So we just had an event where most active organizations in this field were in the same room and were describing their experiences in different streams. So what we found out was that we should start with building networks based on trust wherever we go, because this has to somehow have this bottom-up element, otherwise it wouldn't work. Then the actors in EU have found out that the regional approach has usually been working, because if you already induced thinking about cyber security and cyber awareness in one of the countries, and you pick the regional leader, then the others would come along too. Then we found out that we should create linkages between different cyber communities, the critical information infrastructure providers, or the real serious business that actually depends on IT, the CERTs, and then the police, law enforcement, judicial community. Then we found out that institutional capacity is very varying in third countries. And then, therefore, it's important to have also sometimes a little top-down approach, because there should be government buy-in, for instance, when we build the CERTs. And then we found out that there are major sustainability issues of the efforts. And I was just listening to the South African colleague, and I think 2 or 3 EU countries have been to South Africa and have built up something at different points of time. And you are now saying that nothing actually has happened there. So I think something has happened, but possibly this has vanished, or maybe it wasn't. There was no government buy-in possibly, and that's why it did not get a hold. And this is my last slide, the research question in cyber capacity building. This is the academic institution here today, and that's why I put some questions, which we had been also pondering on collectively. So I think we have to think how to concentrate on institution building versus one project approach and only training. Then we have to think about the coordination between donors and recipients. We have to very much concentrate on development aid communities, the development aid agencies, and how to link them to cyber business, because they are the ones in the end who have to do the work. Then we have to think how to assist the civilian, public policy and civil society actors in those countries. Also, we have to think about different models for different countries, because the countries are very, very, with a very varying institutional and cultural structures out there. We need to bring in the private sector, and the question always is how. We have to possibly say how, because the private sector always comes and says, yes, we are in, so what should we do? And then we are saying, yeah, you should be in, yeah, we are in. Yeah, so the usual story. And then, of course, the bottom-up capacity building is the most sustainable, and the trust-based networks should be there in order to sustain it in long run between the private sector, the law enforcement community, and the technical CERT community and CIIP public policy community. So, I think I had some other comments, but possibly I will not start with those. So these are the research questions that we are trying to answer, and possibly we will organize few events in the future to answer these questions, and we would be very happy to come to whatever event you in this room will organize on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Heli. So we've had some key agreements emerging here. I think the importance of frameworks, and I think the agreement that underpins both of your frameworks is that what this actually is about is securing the economy, innovation, and even lifestyle, which brings us back to the jacuzzi from earlier. That we basically that's what we are securing. It's not about securing technology. It's securing those things, and that trust plays a key role in that. If the actors involved can't trust, we've got a problem. And what undermines trust is risk and uncertainty, and trying to manage that is and really what we need is different approaches to managing that risk and uncertainty in different cultures, different circumstances, I think. So with that as a starting point, we've got more questions. So if you could start at the back, maybe, and then come to the colleagues here at the front. So Ivan first, and then I think Cy Goodman next week. Yeah, start with Ivan, please.
A quick question for Haley. I was interested in what you said on the how successful voluntary partnerships have been in Estonia, but as you said, that model perhaps doesn't stretch to larger countries. I read of a much larger industrialized country that developed a set of voluntary standards for critical infrastructure providers and only got 25% take-up. I wondered if you had any thoughts about how to make that voluntary model go a little bit further. Maybe not right up to the largest countries, but is it only the Nordic countries with that real tradition of partnership where that works, or do you think it can work elsewhere?
Okay, I answer. I think this is the usual question that I get from all my American colleagues too. How exactly, the industry colleagues, how exactly you do it, and can we do it in the US? And my usual response has been that I think if you would think of dividing the large US into the states, for instance, like state of Minnesota, or take one small state and start from there, start from the state level. And if you need more critical national providers, they possibly can do it somehow also between themselves, with some involvement with some government agency which is not too intrusive. And I think the NIST framework possibly can achieve something, but of course I'm not an insider in US business, so I don't comment on this. So I'm not saying it's not possible. It is possible, but there are some challenges. So.
My question is also for Ms. Terma Klar. First, a comment on what was just raised. We've looked into doing things at the state and local government levels in the United States, and what you've described may be geographically comparable in terms of square miles or square kilometers, but it is administratively inconceivable. Whatever problems we have at the national level exist in much worse conditions at the state and local government level. But the question that I have for you is, first of all, I'm thrilled to see, been sort of out of this business for a while, that at least one country claims to have a national strategy that has successfully been implemented. How do you know that? I mean, by what criteria have you not only decided that you've been successful, but this has been now 6 years or so since the attacks that you've responded to with a national strategy. How do you know you were successful, and how do you continue to think that you remain successful?
Yeah, the last part is very important. I think what happened with the first strategy, actually Estonia is now putting together this next one, the second one. It's already there, I think. It's in the final governmental decision stage. So it's always it's always easier to do the first one, possibly, if it's the absolute first one, because then people are more motivated. There is buy-in from the national agencies, especially if there was an incident, so it also helped. Then, of course, there were hurdles. The implementation happened to be during the period where the European economy went down. And there had been some the priorities had to be maybe changed in halfway sometimes. And I think the strategy might not have actually reached all its goals, but since it was quite narrowly scoped to focus on most critical, so it wasn't absolutely unrealistic. We did not touch national defense, national security. We did not touch cybercrime, because cybercrime had a different strategy at that time. So it was just the CIIP, Critical Information Infrastructure Protection. So the organizational part of it, actually, even. So it was a very narrowly focused first step of making more resilient cyberspace, because the Estonians are really dependent on online services. They cannot park the car without mobile phone. They freak out if there is no possibility to park a car without mobile phone. So, you know, it's a very different place. And therefore, the focus had to be very clear. I think this helped. And also the restructuring of the government a little, according to the goals in the strategy, also helped. So
I can believe that you have made critical infrastructure in Estonia more resilient. Okay, whatever you've done, you probably, it's pretty self-evident that doing more than you had done before makes it more resilient. But there was an implication, perhaps I read too much in what you said, that you have really succeeded in making it very resilient. And I'd like to know by what criteria you have come to that conclusion at a national level for whatever set of critical infrastructures you've looked at. And then again, there is this continuation. This is not a static achievement. Yeah. You need to continue to keep it resilient against the changing, if you like, threat or technological environment. I don't know if you're going into smart grids or what have you, but the technological environment is changing or might be changing, and keeping the changed infrastructures, you know, gas distribution, whatever, resiliently secure, safe and secure, is a very dynamic problem, and I'm wondering how you're continuing to do that.
there is a second strategy, so I think they should do it now.
So I have a question that concerns actually is aimed at both Derek and Heli. I agree with you that it's really important to get leaders, particularly in industry, to take this seriously. I don't think the American problem is particularly intractable. There is an organization that requires training by boards, and if the boards in public companies don't take that training, then they are downgraded such that large investors, usually funds, big funds, will downgrade the stock. So they lose financially as a result of not having that training. Now you can imagine a circumstance where you say training in cybersecurity is a requirement. It's one of the check marks that you get against your stock when the private institutional investors think about investing in that stock. You'll lose money, your equity will go down. Now, what I was particularly interested in, well, this is an idea. I mean, this idea came up when you were talking, so I think it's an interesting one. But I was interested in what Derek was saying about you entered into a process by which people could learn this stuff. Because I think the model where CIOs talk the language of CEOs, that's sort of failed a bit on lots of other projects. But what was your process by which you you felt that industrial leaders could learn about this kind of thing?
There's a couple of things. So one was the principles and guidelines that I mentioned previously. When we drafted those, we brought together people who were experts in security, risk, operations, legal, but we also brought in two individuals in particular that had each sat on boards of major multinationals for 20 years each plus. And they essentially took everything that everybody else said and said none of that makes any sense. And they translated it into some very, very simple language that makes sense to board members. One of the statements they made was, one of the challenges and why it always fails is when cybersecurity experts would go into the boardroom, they often speak in terms of rules or standards, but actually they're entering into a principle-based environment. And so that was one thing, and that document that we have been circulating now actually kicks off a process within organizations. So the average, even though it's been specifically designed to introduce absolutely zero responsibility to the company for the CEO to sign these principles, it still takes on average between 9 and 10 months for a company to sign it. And it's because they use it as a tool to socialize these ideas among the board and the different executives in the next level down, so that they can begin to understand what does this mean for my part of my business. So that's one. The other one is really just ongoing dialogue, and in that sense, often it's not actually talking about cybersecurity. It's talking about whatever they want to talk about, and then showing that whatever they think is important depends upon this underpinning. So different industries will come along in different phases and be concerned about different things. The retail industry might come along and talk about e-commerce. The oil and gas company all of a sudden wanted to talk to us last October. So they'll come along with different things, and they'll frame the question in very different language. And they may start somewhere completely left field, but starting there, and then the one additional thing that I actually found is very useful there is bringing in other CEOs from other industries that have been through it. So, they ask CEOs from the oil and gas industry, say, we want an expert to come into our meeting where we're all together. We'll say, yes, fine, but we'll also send in a CEO of another critical infrastructure company that's been through the journey, a telecom company, for example, and they'll go and do that.
So you can imagine partnering with someone like the NACD, National Association of Corporate Directors, to do something exactly like this, with the motivation being, hey, your equity is going to hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's great, and I think the program that you guys are starting is brilliant. I actually have a note. I had a note on the wall of my desk for about 18 months to say how many business schools teach cybersecurity and how many master's courses in computer science teach how to speak to the board. And when I heard you guys were starting the program, I was able to take that note down and throw it in.
Good. So that's definitely something that could be used more widely. If there's already a curriculum, and maybe you're building a network of CEOs who've been through the process and who can start to guide and mentor other. So that would be a really good starting point. Final question, or maybe one or two?
Hi, so this touches on a couple of panels. It's something that Derek mentioned fairly early on in this talk about shifting norms and shifting targets. There's a sort of model of evolution, change, and dynamism that I think he was trying to sort of preface his talk with, which I found really interesting. But I don't know if you guys remember us all the way back to this morning at Ian's panel on human rights. One of the gentlemen from the audience, I think his name was John Shaw, raised the issue of isn't the dilemma that governments face between security and privacy an ancient one, and what is it that cyber actually changes about this? And why I mentioned that in your context is because you mentioned specifically something, my notes here, something about privacy has changed, norms like privacy have changed. It doesn't mean the same thing that it did. And why I raise this is because I've sat through a number of U.S. military talks about justice and the laws of war and new technology like robotic, killing platforms, especially drones. And what's really striking is that in their justifications, their Department of Justice justifications for the use of drones in targeting, for instance, what they'll say is something really quite remarkable. The technology is new, therefore the laws have to change. The ancient principles that we have can't keep up with the changes of technology. And I wonder if you were saying something that was sort of like that, because it runs a real risk, it strikes me, of having the technology drive our principles rather than our principles drive the use of the technology. And if you could comment on that. It seems to me sometimes things stretch without breaking. And so then it makes sense to use the old stuff. And other times we do reach threshold effects in technological changes that do demand new laws.
Sure, okay, I'll try and keep it short because
Yes.
I'm just trying to. So I agree with everything that you said except for the piece around. I'm not trying to say that technology drives norms. I think quite the opposite. I think that technology and the way that we shape the internet and the way that we shape how we use and take advantage of connected everything is something that we shape, absolutely. I think some of the, if you look at privacy, you can break it down to 4 or 5 distinct arms. And they may be different in a digital environment to a non-digital environment. So I think it just forces us to reevaluate what is it that we're trying to protect and what do we value. So it's just it's a reframing of the discussion. But I think you're right. I don't think that there's anything necessary about it in terms of technological fatalism or something like that.
No, nothing to add.
So the lady in blue.
Hi, I'm Maria Farrell. I have a question for Derek, but maybe more broadly for the panel, and it's to do with the framing of cybersecurity, that it can be framed most constructively as largely an economic issue. And I take issue with that because I think in the internet governance world, we're engaged in a struggle for control of the internet with China, with Russia, and with Saudi, with Iran, and they, those countries very much see the internet and cybersecurity as an issue not of just a rising tide raises all boats, and we'll have more trade and we'll have more productivity and we'll have even a higher, better Gini coefficient. They really see this as an issue of failing or weakening state capacity, driven by the internet and driven by cybersecurity, which is what the Chinese refer to as any threat to their sovereignty or our government on the internet. And they really see this not as an economic issue, but as something that is almost an existential issue for them as states, and in terms of their state capacity and the relationship between the individual and the state. And so, I think if we don't address that, we're in trouble. And so there are countries, and that's why I think this Cybersecurity Capacity Centre is so important, and also the London process, because I think what those are doing is giving the courtesy of saying, we accept, at least implicitly, that there are issues for states and their capacity and the relationship with citizens, and saying we will help you, the Mexicos, the Malaysias, the sort of middle income or middling states, or the states that are struggling with this the most, and saying we'll help you build capacity. And I think that's really important rather than just as an economic issue.
Yeah.
So give Adrian a chance to answer questions.
So I would suggest that if we do cyber, and I'm going to say cyber capacity building rather than cybersecurity capacity building, because I want to use the broader focus. If we do cyber capacity building in a multi-stakeholder way and in a way that respects freedom of expression and human rights, then I think we help build stronger relationships around the world, as you're suggesting, and we illustrate the benefits of the value system that we espouse. We can do capacity building in a way that builds support for that kind of an open internet just by doing it right.
So when you said you were going to heckle me at the break, I thought you were joking. So I agree with everything that you say, and I don't think the goal is to say it's just an economic issue. I think it's that there's also a space to talk about it as an economic issue, and to help other countries, as well as I think even ministers in our own countries across different domains, understand that decisions that we make in one domain will have a knock-on effect in others. And one of those knock-on areas that hasn't as much attention as other areas is the economic domain. But so the other thing I do with the forum, by the way, is work on the future of the Internet Global Agenda Council on internet governance issues. So very, very sympathetic to the concerns that you're raising there.
Yeah, I think it's a very important remark that you made. It is actually much more political issue, but since we are today just brainstorming, we can just somehow break it down. But of course it is a political issue, and that's why we are supposed to be doing capacity building to show to these governments and to the citizens in these countries that they can all benefit the positive side of cyberspace. So that this is our ultimate goal. Not the capacity building itself, but they would believe in multi-stakeholder system.
Okay, that brings us to the close of this panel, and I'd like to hand over to Sadie and James.
Okay, I'm very conscious that Sadie and I are the only things keeping you between this and the cocktail reception next door, so I'm going to keep it really brief. I'm Jamie Saunders from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, the Director of International Cyber Policy, and we've been working very close with Sadie and her team on the creation of this centre. Of course, the focus of the centre is on building cybersecurity capacity on an international basis, and the aim is to provide a firm academic foundation on which to deliver real-world impacts. We've had a very rich discussion today and some really positive examples of good practice, but it is obviously from today a very complex issue. But if it wasn't a complex issue, we wouldn't need the centre and we wouldn't need the help from the Martin School. Now, I think, as a number of people have said, there is a lot of activity already underway on cybersecurity capacity building, but the real challenges for the centre I see as threefold. The first is, how can individual countries navigate the many sources of supply that are out there and work out what is best to meet their needs in their circumstances? The second challenge is, how can we make sure that overall global demand is matched by supply, including unlocking some of the funding which we believe there is in countries and indeed the private sector. And then the third challenge is on how to evaluate capacity building interventions and ensure that they're delivering what is really required. So Sadie is going to say a few words about how the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Centre will be taking this work forward and exactly what happens next, which leaves me simply to thank her and the team and to congratulate the centre on its launch.
So I really am the last speaker of the day, which means I'll try and keep this super fast. Thank you, Jamie, for your kind words. And thank you all for dedicating your time today, and those of you that have joined us via the internet, and to our excellent speakers. And final shout goes out to Lucy for her organisational skills, which far surpass the rest of us. It's incredibly important that this is an inclusive debate. And a key aspect of the Centre's work is in convening and bringing people together. And I'm sure there's some very well-known speakers to you today and some worn speakers and topics that perhaps are not as worn as they should be, frankly. This is a fast-changing area in terms of technology environment, in terms of our consumption of data and information and how we create more of it, as well as our ability to collect data on attacks and threats, which give us differing lenses into what that environment looks like. So whilst the problems are old, the risk and our understanding of it is certainly changing. It would be very nice if this was simply the same old thing, if it stayed the same, but the reality is that it's not. Cyberspace is creating change, and that's not limited to cyberspace. So I hope that you all had the opportunity to hear new voices and to make new acquaintances. And we felt an obligation in constructing such an inaugural conference as this one to address some of the rather current and tricky issues that we face as a community, as well as taking the chance to learn from each other and the experiences that we've had. So I'll say a few words on my personal reflection of the day and what we've been discussing. We absolutely must do capacity building, and this is what this is about, responsibly and with consideration of the citizens of cyberspace in the world, hence why we must reflect on culture and issues of human rights. But I feel we also have to be pragmatic about this. We have to make progress, and we've heard people say that different ways today, and we have to make progress in a world where we have differing views. And we're going to continue to have differing views. So we must engage with people and peoples whose standards may not match our own, and we have to find a way forward on that. We've heard about some fascinating initiatives which we can take lessons from, and the Centre will certainly be helping us all to borrow from each other, better coordinate, and reduce the reinvention costs. And by gathering a map of this experience and case studies, we'll help to connect you with each other and give you access to that. But the knowledge of what must be coupled with the knowledge of why, how, and when, and in particular also what success looks like. And the work of organisations like the OECD, Meridian, and the OSCE provide platforms for change delivery that we can borrow from. We're very excited to be collaborating with the World Economic Forum, shaping the agenda in this space, in particular with their stakeholder community, and the European External Action Service, in order to push forward on what should be done in terms of capacity building, as well as the how. So inclusivity, multi-stakeholder approaches, building trust, understanding our commonalities, cooperation, but also who is able and best placed to take action. And that also goes to understanding the economic issues that surround these things. Finally, and my personal reflection of the day, I want to thank Adrian for drawing together the debate on models and metrics that was bubbling along throughout the day. It's certainly incredibly important, and we've heard from many speakers about the need for data and evidence for need. And one of the key outputs that this centre is working on is a capacity maturity model, and that model seeks to document and help us all understand the various nuances of what it means to have capacity in cybersecurity across 5 dimensions, and I'm not going to go through them all. You've all got the brochure, and many of you are already working on those topics with us. Not just the stuff you need to be able to do, but what maturity looks like over time, how these things interact with each other, when and where you should seek to increase your maturity, your ability to deliver this kind of capability, and when you should not, when it does not make sense to make that kind of investment. And in so doing, in so creating that model, we should be able to benchmark ourselves and be able to make much more strategic plans as we move forward. It's so important in that endeavour that together we embrace all opinions and thinking. And we thank you today, and we thank you in advance for taking the time to listen to each other and to contribute to that. And in particular, when you have differences of opinion with each other, because it's an important part of the scientific process that we take inputs from diverse sources in order to formulate these models and to test them. And in the case of cybersecurity, that means from differing regions and organisations with varying different levels of experience and views. So, just to conclude, moving forward into 2014, I thought I should at least say a few very specific actions that we can engage with each other on. So we will be creating the first draft of our capacity maturity model. This will be open for consultation in the spring. We're already working on it, and the working groups are driving that first version, but it will be an exceptionally open thing, and it will evolve. And we will push it out for the widest possible consultation. So I'd encourage all of you, even if you're working in a particular dimension on a working group, to engage broadly across the dimensions and to help promote this and help increase the amount of data that we collect across the world. In March, we're going to convene an event of a similar size to this one to explore the practical and pragmatic options we have in how to overcome the challenges in building cybersecurity capacity. Particular topics, of course, are going to be driven in part by a reflection of today. We will go on collecting case studies on what works, what doesn't work, and why, and we'll make all of those available on the website openly so we can all borrow from each other. and collaboratively we can crowdsource the validation of the maturity model. And we'll be using that data in conjunction with our own work on the first draft of the model to analyse where the gaps are and where we need to focus our collaborations. So this will be a living and evolving analysis, but again, the first capture will be available by the spring. We're also looking at the utility of a portal concept, where industry might publish its own research and its own information on products, which can be linked back to this maturity model. And we'll be exploring whether that's any use to people in the world, whether that connection, that immediate connection with the model, has some utility. If we can, by linking solutions and risk control mechanisms directly to the model, whether that will add value to people and actually help us do more faster. So this is all about the practical. So in addition to the big events, there'll be lots of smaller discussions. I apologise to those of you on the web. They're not likely to be webcast. They won't be in this room. There'll be opportunities, and keep a watching brief on our online diary, because there'll be opportunities to drop in and just engage with the centre, physically and virtually. And as our working groups produce papers, we'll be pushing them out for comment, and we'll be asking all of you if you'll help contribute to the discussion and the debate to make sure that we have the utmost scientific rigour applied to all of these ideas. And finally, before I sit down and hand you over to the drinks, I just want to reiterate that this is about addressing the real intellectual challenges associated with capacity building and also having real impact, which means translating that intellectual effort and that endeavour into practical policy and investment options. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward to more engagement in 2014. You know where to go.